Okay, welcome everybody to lesson 11 for Education for Nepal English Group. This is our YouTube channel for past lesson recordings. And today we'll be teaching chemistry, physics, and history. So today in chemistry, we'll be talking about alloys. Okay, so we'll first start off with compounds. So the most important takeaway here is that alloys are not compounds. So as we all know, there are many different kinds of compounds. Here's two really common ones. We have the ionic compound, which is just a nonmetal plus a metal. An example would be like salt, which is made with sodium and chloride, sodium being the metal and chloride being the nonmetal. And a covalent compound like water, which is just made of two nonmetals. So an alloy is formed when you combine two or more metals. Now, alloys can also be made with metals and non-metals, but you generally have to have at least two or more metals there. So one famous example for alloys is steel. Now, steel is used pretty much everywhere since like the middle 1800s when it was cheap, when the Bessemer process was made and steel was able to be cheaply made. So steel is made actually mostly of iron and carbon. Now you'll say, hey, isn't carbon a nonmetal? Well, yes, but these are just the two main components. Outside of iron and carbon, steel is consistent is made up of other metals too. It's just that they are used in very small quantities, so we don't really consider them that much. So steel, like I said, is used almost everywhere because it's a really strong metal, and right now it's like cheap to make. So people use it from everywhere from making buildings to like making cars and like other stuff. So here are two other examples of alloys. These are also very common ones. The first one's brass. This is made with copper and zinc. Now, this is most commonly used for instruments, although it could be used for other things too. And yeah, another example is bronze. Bronze is a alloy that is also made of copper, but instead of using zinc, you have to use tin to make it. And bronze has been used by humans for thousands of years, beginning back in like, I don't know, ancient China or something when they used it for farming. And then we have other examples here that are probably less known, like white gold, stainless steel, and like gunmetal. So there are actually two different types of alloys. The first one is substitutional, which is kind of in the name. This is when the metal atoms are like roughly equal in size, and they kind of substitute each other's positions when forming the compound. The other type of alloy is called interstitial, and this is when one atom is a lot smaller than the other. So the smaller atom wouldn't be able to substitute the position of the bigger one, so it just goes in between the bigger ones. For example, steel is a interstitial alloy because carbon is much smaller than iron, so carbon goes in between the iron atoms. But yeah,
Okay, so for physics today, we're just going to be doing a review on energy. So, as we learned before, energy is the application of a force over a distance. So the work is pretty much equal to the change in energy, and the work would be force times distance. Um, yeah, where in that equation, F equals force, D equals distance. Um, the force must be parallel to the distance. So that's why you usually use cosine in the equation. So force times distance times cosine theta, if there's an angle. And then work is a scalar quantity. However, there can be positive, negative, and zero work, which I'll explain later. Okay, so here's some more on energy. So energy cannot be created, nor can it be destroyed, which leads us to two different kinds of energy. So there's kinetic energy and then there's potential energy. So kinetic energy is equal to 1/2 mv squared, where m is the mass, v is the velocity, and the unit will be joules for energy. And then potential energy would be mgh, where um okay where m is equal to mass, g is equal to gravitational force, and then h is equal to height. So yeah, as you can see on the diagram, um, there we have the potential energy, which is mgh at the top, and then we have the kinetic energy as the object is going through the motion. That's the max kinetic energy at the middle, so that's 1/2 mv squared. Yeah. So here's just a quick recap of everything I said. So work is force times distance, which is equal to the change in kinetic energy, and then kinetic energy is equal to 1/2 mv squared. And then positive work would be equal to increasing kinetic energy, while negative work would be equal to decreasing kinetic energy. And then the potential energy is equal to mgh. So you want me to just say the solution?
Just read the problem first.
Okay. If you slowly apply a force of 5 newtons to push a box 2 meters, how much work do you do to the book? Oh, I should have said box, but yeah, how much work do you do? And so here's the answer. It's a pretty simple problem. The work is equal to the force times the distance, and the force is 5 newtons, and then the distance would be 2 meters. So you multiply them together, and you get 10 joules. And then for problem 2, what is the potential energy of a boulder with a mass of 60 kilograms that falls from a 40-meter mountain? So for this problem, you have to use the formula of potential energy is equal to mgh, where the mass is 60 kilograms and the height is 40 meters. So using those two, we just have to multiply them as, and so we have 60 kilograms multiplied by the gravitational force, which is 10, multiplied by 40 meters, and we get 24,000 joules.
All right, in history, we'll be covering the civil rights movement. So in the 1800s, this was before the Civil started. There was Nat Turner's slave revolt, which caused more laws to be passed that prevented slaves from being taught how to read and write. But despite this, African Americans were still freeing themselves from slavery and learning these skills. The most famous being Frederick Douglass, who wrote an autobiography that made known better the horrors of slavery. And then some other things that happened were the Emancipation Proclamation, which announced all slaves to be free in the South during the Civil War, which didn't do much, but and then there was a 13th Amendment, which freed all the slaves. And then also the 14th and 15th, which gave legal equality and voting rights to slaves. All right, and then the actual civil rights movements. It was a movement to end racial discrimination by Black Americans. It started in the late 1940s and ended in the late 1960s, although its roots can be traced back a few centuries. And it was mostly nonviolent. Alright, so some events were the execution order 9981, which was by Truman, which ended racial segregation in the military. And then in 1954, there was Brown versus Board of Education, which was a series of 5 cases that effectively ended racial segregation in public schools. Although some did it anyways. And then Emmett Till, he was a 14-year-old African American, and he was murdered for having allegedly flirted with a white woman. And his murderers were acquitted, which brought a lot of news to the injustices that Black Americans face. And then some more events was Rosa Parks, pretty famous. She just refused to give her seat to a white man, which prompted the Montgomery bus boycott, where they just didn't ride the bus for a year. There's a Little Rock Nine, which is where 9 African American students were integrated into Little Rock Central High School. And even as federal troops escorted them in, they were still being harassed by the protesters. And then there was also the Freedom Riders, which were black and white activists, which protested by attempting to use white-only bathrooms at lunch counters, and they encountered extreme violence while they just sat there. And then the last few events, Martin Luther King Jr. gives his famous speech in 1963. Lyndon B. Johnson, or President Lyndon B. Johnson at the time, signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prevented employers to discriminate based on race, color, sex, or religion. He signed a bunch of other acts that I didn't include, such as one that I think didn't allow property owners or didn't allow people to discriminate by giving people like a house. And then lastly, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated from his balcony. Then an overview. So overall, it was a great success. It was mostly nonviolent, and it brought about massive change in law and public practice. It secured legal protection of rights and freedoms for African Americans. But it wasn't like it didn't solve discrimination. It's still present today, which can be seen in 2020 when George Floyd died and tons of protests that happened. That's it.
Thank you all for coming. And we would appreciate it if you guys can fill out this feedback form. And then after you guys are done, you guys can feel free to leave the meeting.